Welcome to Capri College Public Policy 101. My name is Diana Thorburn. I'm Capri's Director of Research. And even though I haven't been in the classroom in a long time, I used to be a lecturer. So I am bringing to this my years of working at Capri and my experience as a lecturer. So I do have a few classroom tips and tricks that I hopefully will be able to bring out of the archive to make this a fun and enjoyable session this morning. CAPRI is the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. We're an independent public policy think tank based at the University of the West Indies, Mona. And we are also part of several international and regional think tank consortia, one of which is a Latin American think tank group, which every year celebrates a week of evidence, Semana de la Evidencia. And it's always been my wish to participate in this activity to share the love and promote the use of evidence in policymaking beyond just the reports that we write and the public launches that we put on, but to share how and why evidence is so important in public policy making with a broader audience. So this week we have several activities, including this one, which is our first for the week. And we encourage you to sign up for and attend the other ones, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end, and I'll do another little promo and reminder. The other thing I would ask you to do is if you could just put in the chat where you are joining from, and if you are part of a school or organization, what school or organization that is, if you could put that in the chat so we can have an idea of who's here. The part of our participation in the week is also to report on how we did and what we did. So we'd like to know where you are and where you're coming from. We will be recording this session and making it available after this. And we will do questions with the hands up feature at the end. So you can jot down your questions. You can put them in the chat. I can't promise I'll get to them in the chat, but I will be looking out for hands up at the end of the lecture, so to speak. We have an hour and a half slated for this. I anticipate a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and get through within 45 minutes to 60 minutes. We'll see how that goes. And so that we have a lot of time for questions and answers. Okay, so we're going to do three things today. We are going to talk about what is a think tank, what is research, and about the communication of how to do research and the communication of research. So but by the end of this class, you should be able to explain what research is, specifically public policy research, define public policy, understand what a think tank is and does, and understand the importance of communication. Communication is really what we often call the secret sauce of the impact that we're able to have both on policymakers and with the broader public. Okay, so the first thing, what is a think tank? A think tank is generally an organization that does research to influence policy, specifically evidence-informed research. There may be think tanks out there that aren't so big on the evidence part of it, but almost by definition, a think tank is supposed to be using evidence and data to inform the research, which is to inform public policy. And I'm going to get in a bit into what public policy is in a short while. So we use evidence in our case to help solve local and regional problems. The focus of CAPRI in terms of the research that we do research on the economy, the environment, governance, and social issues, many of which overlap. I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we have done and do. And some of the topics that we work on don't neatly fit into any one of those four categories. But there are think tanks that do work on a huge range of issues. There's think tanks that do work on foreign policy. There's think tanks that do work on democracy, that do work on education, Some think tanks are very, very narrow and specific, focusing only on one thing. Because we are really the only think tank of our type doing impartial, nonpartisan, evidence-based research in the English-speaking Caribbean, we tend to do more issues, work on more issues than other think tanks, say in North America or Europe or even Latin America do, where they tend to be more single issue focused. And one things we can talk about at the end, if you'd like, is how we choose the topics that we work on, the actual specific topics under those 4 categories. So a think tank essentially is an organization that does evidence-based public policy research to inform policies intended to solve, in our case, Jamaican and Caribbean-wide problems. Another thing that a think tank does is it helps to make issues more understandable to the public and sometimes to policymakers as well. We have had policymakers who at the end, say, of a report launch have said to us, "I now understand my portfolio." That's a straight, direct quote from a policymaker at the end of a panel launch that we had some years ago. But one of our roles, and this is a role that we take very seriously at CAPRI, is to kind of break down some of the issues so that the public can understand them. And in this way, we're serving a purpose not only of informing the public, but also of empowering the public. You might hear sometimes that think tanks are a key component of a democratic society, because in simplifying and making public policy issues accessible and understandable to anyone, to anybody who's interested, regular citizens, not just policymakers, we're also giving them the tools to advocate for change, for policy reform, for policy positions. So one of the roles of a think tank is also to break down public policy issues, which can sometimes be presented as very complex. Sometimes they are complex. Sometimes they're more complex than they're made out to be. But a key mission of ours and of many think tanks is to educate the public, enlighten the public on the issues of the day and of the issues that we're dealing with in our reports, of course. Hold on. I'm getting used to this part. So, apart from making information accessible and understandable, we also aim to inform public debate. And that's one of the reasons why we want the issues to be understandable and accessible. And part of that comes with communications, which we'll talk about later. But another role of a think tank is to inform government decisions, to inform public policy making, to inform the way government thinks about an issue, or makes a decision on an issue, makes a policy about an issue, changes a policy. And the different ways in which we do that, we will talk about when we get to that section of the class. So our goal, and I would think the goal of any think tank here or anywhere else, is to conduct research that is high quality, high integrity, evidence informed, and accessible for both policymakers and the general public, as well as sometimes you'll hear us talk about accessible to stakeholders, so people who are in that sector or working on that issue, who will also use the research, whether to inform their own work or to advocate for policy change or policy reform. All right, so having said what a think tank is, and if you have questions about CAPRI specifically or other think tanks, just note them down and we can talk about them later on, is what is research and what is public policy? This is going to be the substantive part of the class. Research is asking and answering questions systematically. It's more than just Googling. It is having a clear understanding of a situation. It's a public policy issue usually, some problem, some unusual statistic, to have a clear understanding of it and the context in which it is, and then setting out to answer whatever question it is that you might have about that particular issue. And this will become clearer as I get into some examples of some of the research questions that we have asked and some of the public policy issues that we have addressed and the reports that we have produced in response. So it's a systematic asking and answering of a question. It's collecting information, mainly data, and we'll talk about data, to inform and encourage better decisions for better public policies, ideally for better outcomes for citizens and for our country, for the national interest. What is a public policy? A public policy is essentially anything that a government chooses to do or not to do. It can be a law, a regulation, a program, a decision, anything that affects society, very broadly speaking, anything that affects the environment, anything that affects the economy, anything that affects the education system, the public health system, any branch of government that is doing work, as all branches of government are supposed to do, are working in policy. It is the guidelines that inform what they do at any given moment, what the mandate of their ministry is, what the work program of a ministry is, what a department or agency or other government entity does, and also does not do. Those are all what public policies are comprised of. Any research question that you're going to embark on, that we embark on, should be clear, specific, and answerable. A lot of time is often spent on figuring out exactly what it is we're trying to ask. And I'll bring up an example from now, which is when we did this report, Hits and Misses, which was on women in organized violence. We worked on this report for over 5 years. And the reason why it took us such a long time was not just because we undertook extensive research, but it took us a while to actually figure out what is it do we actually want to know. We knew that there was this idea that there was a lack of knowledge on women in crime, but we weren't really certain until we had thought about it and already done a lot of research that ended up not being very useful because we didn't know what we're really looking for, but to figure out what it is that we're trying to understand. And eventually we landed on, we wanted to better understand women's roles, specifically in organized violence, not just women as violent actors or women criminals, women commit crime and have committed crime, ever since. But we wanted specifically to understand the roles of women in organized violence in the Jamaican context, because organized violence is Jamaica's biggest problem. But even after we had figured out that is a question that we're asking, we then had to think, okay, well, how do we answer that question? So any research question, any public policy research question has to be clear, specific, and answerable. Because if you don't know what you're asking, and if you don't know why you're asking it, then you're not going to be very successful in answering it. And you're going to spend a lot of time and, certainly in my case, be very stressed out about trying to figure out what it is you're doing until you have it clear and specific. And I'll share more examples of what clear, specific questions are and answering them when we talk more about methodology. So research design, this is what we spend a good amount of time, of our time here, well, certainly me, that I spend a good amount of my time in the work that I do here at CAPRI. What is research design? This is how a research question is going to be asked and answered. And it entails several different components. It entails a methodology, the method of inquiry, so how you ask the question, how you answer the question, what are you going to be who are you going to be looking at? Meaning, what is the population that you're going to be getting your information from? Not all research has a sample, not all studies have a sample, but we'll talk about what a sample is shortly. The sources of information, that's very, very important. And then what are the limitations? You know, there are many questions, many research questions, you know, all around us, especially to do with public policy. And some of them are simply not answerable because of limitations, largely to do with methodology and how a question can be answered. So we can ask a lot of questions, we can't answer a lot of questions. You know, oftentimes a lot of the work is in figuring out how do we best, that we know what the question is, how do we best answer it to get an answer that is credible, has integrity, is useful, and that can stand up to any challenge of, you know, that if anybody were to say, oh, but what you've done, you know, the study you've done doesn't really tell us anything because of the methodology you've used. We always want to make sure that we're using a methodology that can stand up to scrutiny. So we're going to get into each of these. So a methodology essentially is how you ask and answer a question. I mean, there's a bit of a, you know, there's shades of difference between a research method, a method of inquiry, and a methodology. But for now, we're just going to think of a methodology of how you ask and answer a question. And a lot of times, the first question in the methodology is, are you doing qualitative or quantitative? Broadly speaking, qualitative is anything that doesn't have to do with numbers, and quantitative is anything that does have to do with numbers. And I'm going to give you an example of how that might work. So we did a study called Outside In, which was about the population of people who are outside the labor force. So some of you may know that Jamaica is having record low unemployment, which, you know, in some senses is a good thing. But the flip side of that is that we have a very, excuse me, tight labor market. So you may see in the news often that employers can't find workers, that there's a lack of skilled labor, that there's employers report high turnover, that they're having to compete for employees. And so we had done a study on the low unemployment rate. And one of the questions that came out of that original study, that study was called Growthless Jobs, was the question of, well, how would we increase participation in the labor force? So the way that the unemployment rate is calculated, it's a percentage of people who are in the labor force who are currently unemployed. To be in the labor force means you need to either be working or looking for a job. And this is where definitions are very important. So Jamaica has, you know, nearly 3 million people. It has a labor force of about 1.6 million people, but it has a working age population of about 2.2 million people, meaning people over 14. Once you're over 14, you're considered to be of working age. So even though we have a very low unemployment rate, we also have 800,000 people over the age of 14 who are not considered unemployed because they are not actually looking for a job. So they're not in the labor force. So 800,000 people is a lot of people. And there's a policy question that comes from both the state as well as employers is, well, how do we get some of those 800,000 people who are outside of the labor force into the labor force to try and help ease this tight labor market that is constraining growth, that is hampering employers, hampering businesses from growing and increasing their own production? And so for this study, we had to do both qualitative and quantitative data analysis. So the quantitative data part came from looking at the data set of employment statistics. So we have something in Jamaica called the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, Statin, and they are the government's chief data collection agency. And they collect a lot of data on all sorts of things to do with social and economic life in Jamaica, as well as other aspects of how, who is doing what in Jamaica, everything to do with environmental emissions, trade, lots of different statistics that they collect. But one of the key data sets that they have is the labor force statistics, their labor force statistics. So every few months, they conduct a survey where they ask people how many hours a week they're working, if they're looking for a job, and so on. That kind of data gathering is what we call a data set. So that's usually in some kind of digital format, maybe an Excel file, some other format. And so we were able to get the data set of the labor market survey from Statin. And so we did a quantitative analysis of the data set to have a better understanding of the demographics and characteristics of the population outside of the labor force. One of the first things we found is that even though there's 800,000 people outside the labor force under the age of 18 and over the age of 65. So the way that the working age population is defined, remember, is anybody who's over 14. So if you're 99, you're still considered to be of working age. And so the first thing we did was we took out all the people who were under 18 because we considered them to be students, and everybody over 65 because we considered them to be, if not retired, of retirement age. And that left us with 400,000 people. So we then did a quantitative analysis looking at the different demographic and other characteristics of those 400,000 people. And I won't spend too much more time on this to tell you what we found. The report is on our website. All of our reports are on our website. This one is called Outside In. But in addition to looking at the quantitative data, so looking at, okay, what is the age group of, what are the different age groups of the people who are outside the labor force? What are the reasons that they give in the survey for being outside of the labor force and so on? We also did a qualitative inquiry where we wanted to get the reasons, some of the more personal reasons from people who are outside of the labor force to enhance our understanding of the situation. And so we did something called focus groups. So we did focus groups of samples of people who are outside of the labor force to get some more nuanced and more granular understanding of why people are not in the labor force, why the people who are not in the labor force are not in there. And so for that study, it was both a qualitative and a quantitative study. And I'll bring more examples of how that works. So that's kind of one of the first main questions when you're looking at methodologies. Are you using a qualitative or quantitative? And sometimes it's both, and then you'll often hear what that's called a mixed methods. I mean, and there are, of course, several other subcategories of qualitative data and quantitative data. Apart from the data sets, even in qualitative data, there's something called, I'm just bringing up just one of many, many different other types of qualitative methodologies, is something called a sentiment analysis, where you look to see what people's ideas and thoughts are on a specific topic to get an idea, for example, of public opinion or elite opinion on a certain topic. So that would be a type of qualitative methodology. Then we get to the thing of data, the question of data. Data is a raw material of research. Data is essentially information. It can be numbers, as I said, quantitative data, or it can be information in terms of opinions, views, experiences, observations, all of those, everything that comprises information that would go into answering your question is data. This is the raw material of research. And one of the biggest challenges with data, there's several, is access to data. And in different contexts, issues about data access are more pertinent than others. You know, in some places where there's a strong evidence ecosystem or a strong culture of research and a great deal of transparency, there's data sets on everything. Anything you want to know, you can, go online to whichever agency or organization's website and the data will be there. Jamaica and the Caribbean, not so much. Access to data is one of the biggest challenges that we face as a research organization, and anyone doing research in this context is doing. One of the things I'll always tell new researchers when they join us is that you have to learn to be boof proof. So you are going to be trying to get data from an entity, and they are not going to take your calls. They're not going to respond to your emails. If they do ever answer the phone, they'll say, oh, hold on a second, I'll get back to you. And then the call will disconnect. And you can't take any of that personally. You just have to keep pushing and pushing politely, of course. And also trying, to get it through different ways. I mean, of course, there's the Access to Information Act, which is a very formal way of asking for data, but also sometimes it's doing workarounds. It's just how it is that you're going to get the data. And that is often one of the things that takes up the most time in a study, is getting the data. One of the things that we have found especially, and this is when we're going to get to communication of research, that we'll come back to this, is that sometimes there's data that's out there, but we don't know about it. And it takes sometimes a casual conversation, or when we are at the end of doing the research and we're doing something called our roundtable review, that somebody says, oh, but that data is in such and such a report, or that there's a survey that was done. And so we find out later about that data. But data is really the backbone of a report, of a study. That's the evidence that is used to inform the analysis, the findings, and the recommendations that we found. There's also issues to do with quality of data. So the usability of the data that I'm going to get to in just a second. But one other aspect of methodology and research design that we have to talk about is how we answer the question. So it's about how we ask the question, and also how we answer the question. So it's kind of two different sides of the same coin, but it's part of the whole complex of what the research design is made of, how we ask the question, how we answer the question. But getting back to what I was saying earlier about limitations of data access and accessibility, I'm going to share with you an example of a study that we did on children's mental health. I don't know if you can see this. It was called Mind the Gap. And I like how this study really encapsulates so much of the challenges of data access, data quality, data usability. And after that, I'll talk about baselines first as a separate topic. So this study that we did, Mind the Gap, we were interested in mental health services for children. In 2018, we did a study for UNICEF called the Situation Analysis of Children in Jamaica. And that's a regular knowledge product that UNICEF produces in every country that it works in around the world. We had never done research on children before. And one of the things that stood out to us from that study, we've actually done several studies on children and on the child protection sector since we did that work, was that there were only 2 child psychiatrists in Jamaica. And it was one of those statistics, when we talk later about how do we come about choosing a research topic, or, what is going to be the subject of a report that we're going to work on. Sometimes it's because there's this crazy data point that we can't get out of our heads, and we just have to know how it is that that data point could exist. How is it that statistic could exist? And there are many studies that come out of that as the original question. And so the original question for that study was, how is it that Jamaica only has 2 child psychiatrists? We have a population of nearly 3 million people, 1 million children. It's clear that that is not enough. And so we set about answering that question of why. And one of the interesting things about this study also was that we had extraordinary access to data, which is not usual. Remember, I said you have to be proof when you're doing this kind of work. In this case, we didn't have, nobody was buffing us, because this was a study that other stakeholders also wanted. And so we had extraordinary cooperation from the ministry and from the Jamaica Psychiatric Association, because they also wanted to know the answer to this question. This was a public policy question that many different people wanted answered. It's a public policy problem. 2 child psychiatrists is too few. And to improve children's mental health, which is going to be a public policy objective across the board. There isn't anyone who's at least going to admit to saying that they don't want to improve children's mental health. So we had a lot of data available to us in order to try and answer this question. So in that case, we had both quantitative data and qualitative data. So we were able to get a lot of statistics, a lot of numbers, and then also access to people working in the field to get the qualitative data, their experiences, their understanding, their knowledge, their observations. But what we found very quickly was that even though we had access to the data wasn't very usable. So one of the things that we had to do in the report, in the study, was to have an estimate of what is the need for children's mental health services, meaning how much services are actually needed compared to what is actually being provided. And that is, a basic question of, well, what is the incidence and prevalence of mental health disorders in children? And so we got data from the regional health authorities. So the way that Jamaica's public health system is organized, it's in 4 different regions: Western, Northern, Southern, and Southeastern. And so we got the data from the child guidance clinics, which is the main provider of children's mental health services in Jamaica. They provide 95% of services in Jamaica. We got all the data from the child guidance clinics from all the regions. And from that, we were going to collate all that data to get a quantitative empirical understanding of the levels of mental illness and mental health challenges that need services. But when we got the data, all the regions collected the data differently. Even though they're all part of one ministry and they're all doing child guidance clinics in regions that all pertain to one ministry, they all recorded the prevalence and incidence of the mental health conditions that they were seeing differently. So that data ended up being completely unusable. In the end, what we had to do to estimate what the level of need for mental health services was to refer to other small studies that had come up with an estimate and compare it to international larger studies of what the incidence and prevalence of mental illness was in children, and come up with an estimate that we felt that would give us some confidence that we could then move on with gauging, well, okay, if this is the level of need, then what is the level of services available? And part of that was checking with our stakeholders. Do you agree that this is a correct estimate of what the need is? And it ended up that we estimated, and everybody agreed that this would be a estimate that we could have confidence in, which is that 15% of children in Jamaica have some sort of need for mental health services, which ranges across psychiatric illnesses, psychological conditions, behavioral disorders, and so on. But I spent a lot of time on that example because data is tricky, and it's usually the biggest issue, and it's the biggest component of public policy research that has to be grappled with and dealt with in order to be able to get an answer to the question you're asking and to come up with recommendations for the problem that you're trying to better understand and to solve. I want to say just one other thing about baselines. Another, I would say, probably another of the main challenges that we have in Jamaica and in places like Jamaica where collecting data systematically is not the norm is that we tend not to have baseline data on many things. What is baseline data? Baseline data is the level or number or position that you're starting from. So one of the activities that we're doing for Evidence Week is on plastic bag bans. So we're launching a report on Thursday called Bag Ban Theory, Unpacking Evidence and Capacity Gaps in Caribbean Plastic Policies. And we wanted to know how effective have the plastic bag bans in Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua and Barbuda been. Those three countries, we all implemented plastic bag bans around the same time, all around 5 years ago. And so enough time had passed where the question could now be asked, well, how effective have those bans been? So one of the main data points that we would be looking for, that anyone would look for in trying to answer that question would be, well, has there been a reduction in plastic bag use and pollution since the ban was implemented? And several other questions related to the effectiveness of the bans. And the main challenge we had in doing that study is that none of us, not Jamaica, not Antigua and Barbuda, not Barbados, had any baseline data against which we could measure the impact of the ban. So baselines are always a challenge. Whenever we see a new government program rolling out, we will often say to ourselves, okay, but the only way they're going to know if that program is effective or had any success is if they take a baseline at the very beginning, or if they've had a baseline indicator that they're working with so that they can measure change. So these are some of the issues about data that are, part and parcel of doing this kind of work, of doing public policy research when it comes to data, which is the meat of the research. It's the access, the accessibility, the usability, and the existence or non-existence of a baseline. All right, still talking about research design here, how we do it at CAPRI, and how I think many think tanks probably have some protocol or framework that they apply to each project that they undertake, which amounts to a research design. We start with something called a concept note. So every study that we do, almost every activity that we do, we start with a concept note. And that sets out, everything in a neat 2-page, neatly on 2 pages, everything I just talked about. What are we asking? Why are we asking it? How are we asking it? Where is the data going to come from? And what's the purpose? What is this intended for? I don't know if you can see on the screen here, but this is an example of our concept note template. We often spend a lot of time on a concept note and grappling with all of the issues that I just talked about. I mean, obviously, some of the issues, especially to do with data access and accessibility. And this is generally kind of the blueprint of the research design going forward. And from there, everything kind of follows. So sometimes if we're feeling, you know, and I talked about the study hits and misses when we were trying to figure out that we're asking or answering here, we would often go back to the concept note. Well, what did we actually say we were going to do in the concept note? So that's also part of the research design. You know, for us, we go from the concept note then to a more fulsome proposal, which we then will use to try and get funding for the studies. Research is very expensive. Okay. All right, so we've covered what is public policy, we've covered what is a think tank, we've covered what is research, and now we're going to go to what I said earlier was CAPRI's secret sauce, which is communication. Truth. Research is absolutely useless if nobody knows about it. You could have the most beautifully designed, research is useless if no one knows about it. Right. So I had alluded to this earlier when I had said when we had first started was that sometimes we'll be at the end of a study and at the validation exercise, someone will who's participating in the exercise will say, oh, but there's already a study on XYZ. And we will not have known about it, even though we've spent a year doing research on the topic. And so what happens with a lot of research, and you know, I can only speak to the Jamaican and Caribbean context, this may happen in other places, is that there's a lot of research being done and it's not being communicated. It's not getting out there, it's on a shelf. And this is problematic because research is very expensive. And most research, you know, is providing information and creating knowledge that wasn't there before. So it's a waste of resources. And then also sometimes there's a duplication of resources because then people are going out and doing the research over again. But really any research you do, any report that we do, if we have not disseminated that research, shared the findings, talked about it in public spaces, engaged stakeholders on it, engaged the policymakers on it, tweeted about it, gone on beyond the headlines to talk about it, then we might as well have not done it. Because if people don't know about the work and don't know about the questions that were asked and the answers that were found and the implications for policy, then might as well not have done it. So what does this actually mean? It means having a strong, whether strong or not, it means having a communications component to everything that you do, to all of the work that you do. So, you know, oftentimes we will say that we put as much resources, people, time, money into the communication of our research as into the research itself. Because as I said, it's no use having the research there. And so you need to have a communication component, and it needs to be a well-designed, well-executed research communications component, and one that is constantly being refined and informed. We're not able to do a lot of data gathering on, you know, the impact of our communication. So a lot of it is what we perceive. But as we learn more about what seems to get more traction, get more audience, get more views, get more likes, get more feedback, then we try and do those things more. And so we endeavor in every single project, every single research project that we do, we endeavor to communicate the findings clearly. And depending on the project is also going to determine who we are defining as our audience for any particular type of communication that we're doing. So we determine what the format is for the different audiences that we're trying to reach. So if you go on our website and you look at any one of our studies, you'll usually see 3 knowledge products associated with each study. One is the actual report that's going to contain all the research that was done on the topic. And then you're going to see something called a capsule, which is a 2-page, call it an executive summary of what that study was, so that, you know, we know not everybody's going to want to sit down to read a 40-page report on, you know, the environmental regulatory framework for Jamaica. But people do want to know what the research was about. And so that CAPRI capsule will contain kind of the main basic things that the study found. Another thing you'll find is something called 10 things. 10 things you need to know about increasing participation in the labor force, or 10 things you need to know about women in organized violence. And those are kind of like the 10 main findings that we want people to know and remember from whatever that study was that we had done. So communication, you know, the communication team, the people who are doing our slides, like the slides that I shared with you today, the reports that, you know, with the photos and the graphs and the tables, our social media especially, and I hope you're all following us on our different platforms. We're on Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn. I think we're on TikTok as well. So I hope you're following us on all of those different platforms. Those are key to the work that we do. So yes, we're a research organization, and yes, a think tank is a research organization, but a measure of a think tank's success is not only its ability to influence policy, which of course is a goal, but also how effectively they have, or we have, communicated our research and our findings and our recommendations to the different audiences that we're trying to reach: the general public, policymakers, technocrats, stakeholders, other decision makers, and so on. Okay, so we're at the end. Let's see where we are for time. Okay, I'm not doing bad for time. It's the end, and so I just want to recap. And as you think about the questions that you're going to ask, I want you to think about them in terms of the original goals that we set out for this class, which is, by now, you should know what is a think tank. So if you don't know what that is, formulate a question so that I can get some more clarity on that, because I want you to leave here today knowing what is a think tank. What is public policy? I want everybody who has joined us today to know and be confident that they know what public policy is. What is research? I want you to all be fully sure that you know what research is, and hopefully you'll want to do it. What is methodology? What is the difference between quantitative and qualitative research? And finally, why do we communicate? And I would also say, how do we communicate as well? So that's the end of the lecture. I'm so sorry about those interruptions. That's a brand new experience for us here at CAPRI to have something like that. But I hope it didn't interrupt too much the content of the class itself. And now I am looking forward to some questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll also peek in the chat to see if I see anything in there. Oh, people are spanning. Oh, this is thank you. Hi, Marymount High School. And Bermuda, we have Bermuda in the house. And UTech. Someone's hacked into the meeting. Kayla, slides be sent. We need a new link. Okay. All right. So I'm not seeing any questions in there. And I'm not seeing any hands up. All right. So while you're thinking of a question, I want to share with you another study that we had done that I think will give some good examples of some of the differences in, just going back to some of the points we made earlier about data and data access and data quality. So remember, I talked about the study we had done, hits and misses. This was on women in organized violence. And so for that study, one of the, kind of basic data points that we needed to find was, well, how many women are committing crimes and what types of crimes? And has there been an increase in women committing violent crimes, and what types of violent crimes? And so part of the reason that this study came up as a study for us to do was that there's a general perception across the world that more women are more involved in violent crime and in organized violent crime, so in gangs and other organized criminal groups. And there's a lot of data from other countries that shows that there's more women being arrested and imprisoned for violent organized crime. So we wanted to see, well, what's the situation in Jamaica? Organized violence is a problem. Do women play a role? What role do they play? And the other thing that we also had noticed that there was a lot of media reports about women in gangs. And so one of the first things we did was go to the arrest and conviction data that was provided to us by the JCF and Department of Corrections. So we had those data sets which broke down the number of women who are being arrested and convicted for different types of crimes. But for Jamaica, the data did not show that women were increasingly involved in organized violence or even in violent crime. There was not an increase in women being arrested or convicted for shooting or for murder, which are the main types of crimes that we associate with organized violent crime. There was an increase in women being arrested and convicted for trafficking. There was an increase in women being arrested and convicted for white-collar crimes, so that's like fraud, but not for organized crime. So then the question became, okay, well, if the quantitative data is not showing us what the qualitative data is claiming that there has been this increase, and also what other data from around the world are showing, then is it that women are not as involved as everybody seems to think, that the media reports seem to think, the anecdotes from security forces and state officials seem to think. So in a way, the study became to ask that question, is like, why is there this mismatch between what the quantitative data says and what the qualitative data says? And so we had to spend a lot of the research energy that we put into the study trying to reconcile that. And we did. We did come up with some explanations, which led us to a conclusion, a guarded conclusion, a tentative conclusion, that even though the quantitative data does not show that there are more women involved in organized violent crime, the qualitative data that we do have does show, and we can look to the qualitative data and have some confidence in saying that, yes, women are involved, more women are involved, and women are increasingly involved. And what was that qualitative data? It was other reports, it was media reports, it was interviews and statements from the security forces themselves. And then also, another data source that we used was the gang trial data. So data coming out of the recent trials on gangs, where in several of the gang cases, there were one or two women who were involved. And so we went into the court documents and the trial transcripts and the reports from the trials to get a better sense of who these women were, what were their motivations, what were their roles. And so that ended up being the main data that we used for the report to better understand the role that women play in organized violence in Jamaica, and then to offer recommendations to the state and stakeholders to, I guess, reduce women's participating in organized violence and violent crime. I would invite everybody who's come here. Thank you very much for joining us. It's the first time we're doing this, so this is new to us, and we're really glad that you came out to hear about public policy from us. We love research, we love methodology, we love evidence, and we are happy to share that with you, and we're happy that you're interested as well. Please join us for our other two events in evidence this week. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we're doing Pitch for Peace, where we're going to be examining evidence-informed policy solutions to Jamaica's security issues. And then on Thursday, we'll be launching our report on plastic bag bans across the Caribbean, bag ban theory. And so we invite you to join us for both of those events. They're free, open to the public. Can come and introduce yourself to us, say, oh, I was at the class on Monday. And again, follow us on our social media and keep in touch with CAPRI. And, we hope that we'll cross paths again soon.